Hey guys, Will here. So today we're going to be taking a look at the new Direct Force Pro Formula wheel as well as some new wheel mounting accessories from VRS. Now this wheel is particularly interesting. A lot of wheels that we've looked at recently have taken the approach of trying to cram as much functionality as they possibly can into the wheel for the price point, whereas this is taking a very different approach. It's a very minimalistic wheel, and the aim here has been to produce the best of the best when it comes to quality for the core functionality that people need for sim racing. So today we're going to unpack all this, see whether they've achieved that goal, and see whether this might be the wheel and the accessories for your setup. Let's go. So before we get started today, a couple of important bits of information as always. So firstly, a big thank you to VRS for sending across this gear for us to check out today. Now in today's video, we will also be cross-comparing against a bunch of other wheels, some of which we've already reviewed here on the channel, others which will be coming up very soon. So it's important that you guys know that everything we'll be looking at today has been sent to us under the exact same conditions. Nobody gets any sort of look at the review or any sort of creative control over it. You guys will be seeing it at the same time as all the manufacturers do. And as always, this is just my own opinions and my own observations, nothing more, nothing less. Now, if you do happen to decide you want to pick up any of the gear you see in today's video, there will be some affiliate links down in the description below. Those are an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. Obviously, there's absolutely no obligation to use those, but if you do find what we do here at Boosted Media valuable, then that is a great way of helping support the channel, and we do really appreciate your support. So let's start off here, as always, by talking about pricing and comparing against the pricing of some other common wheels as well. So starting off with the wheel, the pricing as listed on their website comes out at $997 US dollars or euro, or 1,557 Australian dollars. Now, on their website, they've actually got a really cool system where you can choose the destination country and it automatically adjusts the pricing and the location that it's shipping from as well, so you can see. Now, obviously, you do need to check your local import taxes and duties, things like that. From what I could tell on the website, that pricing did include the relevant taxes, but obviously there may be shipping duties on top of that. But just make sure that you check 100% exactly what you're going to be up against if you do order one of these. And for the other accessories that we have here on the desk, the wheel side quick release comes in at 99 euros or US dollars, or 149 Australian dollars. The 80mm base side shaft comes in at 49 euro or US dollars, or 75 Australian dollars. And the newly designed 70mm hub adapter, I couldn't actually see on their website just yet, but the old version came in at the same price as the hub adapter, so I'm assuming it'll be somewhere around the same ballpark. But as always, just jump on the VRS website via the link down in the description below for all the latest pricing information. So look, I know a lot of people were expecting the VRS wheel when it released to be a lot cheaper. To put it in context here, this is more expensive than the VRS wheelbase, believe it or not, and around about twice the price of their 2 pedal set. Now, we've got reviews on the channel of both of those products already. I would definitely recommend checking those out. But look, those were exceptional value for money in both cases. I'd go as far as to say that the VRS pedals are among some of the best load cell pedals that we've ever tested here at Boosted Media, without even taking the price into consideration. So when you consider the low price point, they are exceptional value for money. And the wheelbase has been really impressive too. We've followed the development of that over time. We did our initial review a number of years ago now, and we did a bit of a second look at that recently, which you can also check out via the links down in the description. Really great quality force feedback. A little bit of work to be done on the software side to bring things up to standard with, say, Simucube, Acertech, and Fanatec, for example. But if you're looking for the best value for money when it comes to the raw driving experience with no bells and whistles attached, then it's very difficult to go past the Direct Force Pro line of products from VRS. So because the pedals and the wheelbase are such exceptional value for money, I think a lot of people were a little bit thrown by the price of the wheel when it came out. And look, I'll admit to you that when I took it out of the box and I looked at it and compared it at face value to a lot of the other wheels that we were looking at today, I did struggle to see the value in it. It wasn't until I actually got hands-on with it, actually drove with it and experienced the wheel, that I kind of got my head around why it costs what it does. And that's what I'm hoping to try and convey to you guys in today's video, because it doesn't have an awful lot of functionality, but what it does do exceptionally well. So let's unpack that in more detail now and take you through exactly what you're going to get with the VRS Direct Force Pro Formula wheel. So what we've got here is a 285mm diameter wheel, which in my opinion at least is pretty much right in the sweet spot for driving anything between, say, Formula style cars all the way through to your GT3s and even your GT4 style cars. So if you're driving driving something that's extremely nimble, like an F1 car, for example, often a smaller diameter wheel can help you to catch those slides and react to what's going on very quickly inside the game. Whereas if you're driving something a little bit bigger and heavier, like a GT3 or GT4 car, then a smaller diameter wheel can feel a little bit unrealistic and a little bit too kind of twitchy to, I guess, match the car authentically. So I find somewhere between about 280 to 290 millimeter suits me really well. The larger the diameter of the wheel, the more it starts to swing around the other way. So if you've got a larger diameter wheel, the car starts to feel a little bit more dampened. You don't feel quite so much detail in the force feedback and you're not able to react quite as quickly. Now we are talking about very small differences here, but if I'm driving an F1 style car with a 300 millimeter wheel, I do find it a little bit more of a struggle than I do with something of this size. So it is a very subjective thing, and I do think that you do adjust your muscle memory to adapt to whatever you are driving with. So I certainly don't think that it's a major issue, but if you are driving with weaker force feedback, then the larger the diameter, the more dampened those effects are going to feel overall. So it is certainly worth considering. Also worth considering as well is the weight. Now, weight again has a dampening effect on the force feedback. So the heavier the wheel, the more soft the effects are going to feel overall. This wheel is not only very, very well balanced, as we'll see later on, but also comes in relatively lightweight as well. So with no quick release attached by my measurement, it comes in at 1,267 grams. And just to quickly compare that against some other common wheels at around this kind of price point, the Ascher Racing F64 USB V3 wheel, which we reviewed just recently on the channel, linked down in the description for you, that comes in at 1,470 odd grams. So quite significantly heavier here. Now on my Simucube 2 Ultimate wheelbase, which I run at around sort of 12 to 15 Newton meters of torque, I actually did quite like the weight of this wheel. I found that it gave me quite an authentic feel. But again, if you're running weaker force feedback than that, then this may end up being a little bit too much on the heavy side for you. Remembering again that if you are running this on a VRS Direct Force Pro wheelbase, that's capable of 25 Newton meters, so none of this is going to be an issue for you really at all. But if we compare against a couple of other wheels just quickly as well, the Cube Controls F Pro comes in at about 1,200 grams, so around about the same kind of weight as the VRS wheel. We're going to come back to that guy in just a minute for some comparison with regards to the material choices. If we look at the Grid MPX wheel, this is another heavy guy. This comes in at 1,680 grams. That's also a slightly larger diameter wheel though, and we will have a review coming of this very soon on the channel. And then lastly, I also just want to quickly compare against the Cube Controls F Core, which is significantly cheaper than what we're paying for the VRS wheel. And this is also lighter as well. So this comes in at just a touch over a kilogram, 1,074 grams. And I was actually really impressed with this wheel for the price. Again, there is a review of this on the channel if you want to check that wheel out as a potential alternative. Now, the way they've kept the weight of this wheel down comes down to the material choices that they've used throughout the wheel. So what we've got here is a 5mm thick CNC machined aluminium front plate. So it is a unibody kind of design here. You've got the aluminium front plate, which extends all the way throughout the grips as well and gives it a good amount of rigidity and strength. So there's not a whole lot of flex or twist here. Definitely no more so than we would expect from a wheel of this price point. But if we flip the wheel around, what we've actually got here on the back is what they describe as an optimized polymer enclosure, which is basically just a fancy way of saying plastic. Let's be honest here. So it is a plastic cover on the back here. Now, that doesn't appear to affect rigidity overall. What I did notice though, however, is when I do twist the wheel, and again, there is very minimal flex there. And if I hold it up to the microphone, you should be able to hear it. There is just a tiny little bit of plastic creaking there. So I don't think that it's anything that you're going to notice when you're driving. I certainly didn't, but I do feel like I need to point that out because that's something that we have highlighted on a lot of Fanatic wheels, which have that plastic shroud on the back too. But if we compare to something like the Cube Controls F Core wheel, which comes in at not a whole lot more than half the price of this wheel, this is actually a carbon fiber front plate with a aluminium enclosure on the back. So again, very, very rigid, just as rigid as we have with the VRS wheel, but no issues with creaking or anything like that. And this wheel actually comes in a little bit lighter than what we have with the VRS wheel. So I understand the reasons why they've chosen those materials, but I'm just not 100% convinced that a carbon fiber front plate with an aluminium enclosure rather than a plastic enclosure wouldn't have been a better choice. But let me know what you guys think about that in the comments below. The only disadvantage, admittedly, is just that little tiny bit of plastic creaking, at least in my observation. It certainly doesn't appear to contribute to any flex or anything like that. Even the way the shifters are mounted, we will have a look inside a little bit later on, but even the way the shifters are mounted and the analog paddles down the bottom, there's no flex inherent there at all. So yeah, I certainly don't see it as a problem, but in fairness, comparing to other wheels at around this kind of price point, you are getting either a aluminium or carbon fiber front plate and a aluminium rear housing. So it is what it is. I certainly don't see it as a deal breaker by any means, but I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't at least point it out to you guys so you can make your own judgment call on that. What I can tell you though is that all the touch points on this wheel, so all the switches, all the paddles, everything like that are all absolutely beautiful quality. And I don't say that lightly at all. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 push buttons on either side of the wheel. These are a really interesting design. So you've got a piece of CNC machined aluminium, which is kind of floating in the front plate here. And then you've got a surface mounted switch on the PCB behind this, which the switch activates against. So they've got a really nice positive click to them. It's not super snappy like the Fanatec wheels are, but it also doesn't have that initial squish that some other wheels have as well. So a really intentional click here. If we compare to a Cube Controls wheel, for example, these are a lot more plasticky feeling. Obviously these are plastic touch points, but even if we move across to a more equally priced wheel like the F Pro, for example, still quite plasticky and quite hollow feeling when you push down the buttons. I've never really found it to be a problem, but I have always said that I do prefer the slightly dampened, I guess you could describe it, feeling of the buttons that we get on the Ascher Racing wheels. These have got a little bit more, hopefully you can see that on camera. As I push down, you can see it squishes quite a bit before the button actually activates. Whereas on this guy, you can see there's only a minimal amount of squish there before it clicks in. So yeah, I would definitely say these are among the best, if not the best buttons that I've ever felt on a sim racing wheel. And that is definitely saying something considering the number of wheels that we've tested here. So again, this is kind of playing into what I was saying about, you know, really focusing on providing the best experience in the areas that are most important on the wheel. And again, of course, you're paying for that. It's not quite the same as what we looked at with the F Core in that review, where we kind of said that they're cutting corners in terms of price in the areas where, you know, it doesn't really affect the overall driving experience too much. But again, comparing this, we've got plastic touch points everywhere, whereas on the VRS wheel, everything is metal. One noticeable absence here is, of course, thumb encoders. That is one thing that I always do miss on a wheel that doesn't have them. That is one thing that often is a determining factor on whether or not I use a wheel on my rig day to day. For example, with the F Pro wheel again, what I'll do is have the left-hand side set to ABS and the right-hand side set to traction control. And then I've also got thumb encoders here for my brake bias and my fuel map. What that means is that I'm able to make adjustments to those parameters on the fly, even if I'm mid-corner, without having to adjust my hand position or take my eyes off the road. With a wheel like this guy, obviously, if you're wanting to make those kinds of adjustments, you are having to adjust your hand position, which can throw you off if you're mid-corner. So again, it may not be something that's important to you, but if it is important to you, like it is for me, it is one noticeable absence from the VRS Direct Force Pro wheel. So continuing on with inputs, one thing that I am very happy to see is the presence of 2 7-way funky switches here. So these have rotary encoder functionality, so you can turn them to the left or the right. You can push them up, down, left or right, or push them downwards as well. Now, I always really appreciate any wheel that has 2 of these, simply because I can map one of them to navigating through the menu system, and then I can map the other one to making adjustments to my black box inside the game. So switching between displays or even controlling things like pit stop parameters becomes very, very easy. And for a wheel like this, I often do actually find that I don't even have to use my keyboard and mouse to navigate through menus, obviously depending on the game. But again, it is one thing that I always do look for in a wheel, often a determining factor on whether or not I choose to use a wheel on my rig. So I definitely think it's worth calling that out as a major positive. Now, in terms of the position of these as well, look, they are a little bit awkward. Again, you will have to adjust your hand position to operate them while you're driving. But one of the things I really like about the Grid Engineering MPX wheel is the position of these 7-way switches up the top here. Now, you do still have to adjust your hand position, obviously, to operate the rotary encoder functionality, but you can go up, down, left and right without taking your hands off the wheel. All you have to do is just adjust your thumb position. So you may not like that. I mean, it can be a little bit awkward if the wheel's rotating quickly under your hands, but yeah, it's a subjective thing. I actually really like this positioning and hope that we see that on more wheels in the future. But again, CNC machined aluminium touch points for both of those 7-way switches, and that extends, of course, through to the rotary encoders that we have here too. So those have push button functionality, a good amount of resistance there with nice, clearly defined detents in each position. I wouldn't say that they're particularly remarkable. Again, if we compare to something like the Ascher Racing wheel, They actually feel pretty much exactly the same, to be honest with you guys. There's not really any discernible difference there at all. A good click. They may actually even be exactly the same switches, I'm not sure, but they feel very, very similar to each other. No issues there whatsoever. If you compare to something on the more cheaper end of the scale, like the F-Core wheel, those are a lot looser, and you just don't get quite the same sensation in each position. It is still fine without gloves. I did find with the F-Core wheel with gloves on, the rotary encoders could be a little bit clumsy, whereas with the Ascher Racing wheel, the more expensive Cube Controls F Pro, the MPX and the VRS wheel, just that slightly more definition in each position makes it a little bit easier to feel each click when you're operating with gloves on. And I think if you're looking for a wheel with this price point, you're probably going to be driving with gloves anyway, so that's definitely a good thing. Again, aluminium touch points, as we said before, and they do have push button functionality. And then we move on to the two multi-position switches in the middle here. Now these can be set up in the software to operate either as rotary encoders with pulse width adjustment or as multi-position switches. Now, in terms of the feel of these switches, I've got to say, these are probably the nicest feeling multi-position switches I've ever felt on any sim racing wheel. It's hard to describe, but they almost just glide into the next position. There's a nice amount of sort of spring force there. So you have to overcome that initial resistance, and then it just kind of glides into the next position. So it feels really, really nice. And if I go back to my Ascher Racing wheel again, which again is my kind of benchmark, those do feel really nice as well. A little bit stiffer than what we have here, but yeah, there's not a whole lot in it. But if I had to choose between the two, I would choose the feeling of the VRS switches. So yeah, again, it's just kind of tying in with what we were saying about, you know, there's not a whole lot here, but what there is here is really, really, really well executed. So that is all your inputs on the front of the wheel. Then we flip around to the rear of the wheel. We've got 4 Hall effect sensor paddles here. So no mechanical switches here, nothing that's going to take on dirt and debris or mechanically wear out over time, which is always a good thing. Now look, honestly, with most high-end wheels that are using micro switches these days, you know, they're all sealed units that are made to automotive standards anyway, so they're generally not a problem, but I do like to see Hall effect sensors used. On some of the early Cube Controls wheels, there was a couple of little trim pots that you had to actually manually calibrate, and I did have a couple of instances where the calibration slipped on those wheels, so I wasn't initially sold on the use of Hall effect sensors for this purpose, but over time we've seen that kind of move across to a digital calibration, and as you'll see later on, there are a couple of other adjustments here too for the shifters, which give you even more granular control over the activation and the hysteresis on the paddle. So that is a really, really nice touch that really lets you dial it in to exactly how you like it to feel. Now, another thing that I really like about what they've done with the design here, and we saw this done on the Acertec wheels, as well as I think it was the Liux wheel that we reviewed recently too, if I'm not mistaken. What they've done is they've got a single PCB which runs throughout the entire wheel, and then they've got Hall effect sensors actually surface mounted on that PCB with the magnet on the shifter, which is actually used to activate the Hall effect sensor floating above it. So what that means is that there's no need for any wiring inside the wheel. There's no cables running throughout it or anything like that. It's all very, very, very clean and tidy internally, and that is the case for all 4 of these paddles. So in the case of the 2 shifters, we've got a digital activation with adjustment, as I said before, and then with our analog paddles down the bottom, as you'll see later on, we can calibrate this to be a dual stage clutch, a throttle and a brake, a throttle and a handbrake, for example, basically anything that you want to map an analog axis to. Now, in terms of the feeling of those, a good amount of mechanical resistance there once again, a relatively short throw compared to some of the other wheels that we've tested. If I compare to the Ascher Racing wheel again, specifically, you can see that's got a significantly longer throw. I do feel like these paddles have a subjectively slightly nicer feel to them. They're a little bit less stiff, but they've got a little bit more of a progressive feel to them, which gives you a little bit more muscle memory based control throughout the throw. If we compare to the F Pro wheel, again, a slightly longer throw, but slightly less progressive feel in the activation. Same idea with the F-Core as well. That's actually got exactly the same paddles down the bottom. And then if we go across to the Grid MPX wheel, those actually feel pretty similar to what we have on the VRS, but again, we'll unpack that more when we get into the review of the grid wheel later on. But yeah, I'd say for a dual stage clutch or a handbrake, these are absolutely fine. I think if you are wanting to use these as a throttle and a brake in lieu of the use of pedals, then maybe something like the Ascher Racing that has a little bit more throw, or maybe even the Cube controls, may be a slightly better option, just because the longer the throw, the more control I think you have overall. But then again, I'm not somebody that drives with the throttle and the brake mapped to the wheel, so that's only really a guess on my part. If you do that, let us know down in the comments what you think. Do you prefer a longer throw, or do you prefer something a little bit shorter like what we have here? But in terms of the actual feel, absolutely fine. So the shifters themselves have a really good feel to them as well. Nice, snappy activation there, and a similar amount of throw. I measured it at about 8 millimeters of throw at the tip of the paddle. And yeah, look, I mean, they're probably not the absolute best shifters that I've ever felt in my life subjectively, but they're very, very close. I mean, if we, again, just grab the Ascher Racing wheel, which I think is, at the moment, my favorite. Very, very similar. You can see, as I pull on that shifter, I mean, it's hard to tell on camera. I have to kind of just describe what I'm feeling, but it doesn't really want to go until it goes, and it just kind of snaps into position. And it's very similar with these ones as well. So it's hard to kind of hold it partly throughout the throw. It kind of just always wants to go in one. So it gives it that really nice snappy feel. Now, in terms of adjustability on the paddles, you don't have the ability to extend the paddles in or out. You can see there aren't any little slots there. I think that's probably a good move given the ergonomics of the wheel. I don't think that many people would need to make adjustments there. And obviously having adjustments available creates the opportunity for things to slip and slide and move around. So I'm pretty happy with that. The one adjustment that you do have is actually include a little weird looking tool. It looks like a little key almost, and it's got a little Torx bit of 2 different sizes in there. And what you can do is you can get in and just loosen off the top 2 bolts, and it will pivot around the bottom bolts. And there's a little slot. You can't actually see it on the external face, but on the inside, there's a little slot there, which allows you to move these in and out. Yeah, it's not a huge amount of adjustment there. Now with the clutches, I don't really see a whole lot of need to adjust this in the first place, to be honest with you. Unless you've got really, really small hands and you just struggle to reach the throw at its maximum, I'd say the more throw you have there, the better, as long as it's within reach, basically. So I don't see a whole lot of need to adjust those, but it's good that you do have a little bit of adjustability there. Now, one other small but important observation is they've also included what looks like some little Delrin bump stops, which are actually on the tail side of these 4 screws. So I actually originally thought that these 4 screws were for the throw adjustment, but as we just saw, that's not the case. But if you get down inside there, you can actually see there's a little tiny Delrin pad which just stops you from having that metal-to-metal contact. So it just gives it a slightly quieter and ever so slightly dampened return, rather than having that metal-to-metal contact. So it is a subtle thing. And look, to be honest with you, comparing across to the Ascher Racing wheel, which is metal-to-metal contact, there's not really any discernible difference in the feel or the sound between them. But little details like that do go to show the amount of attention to detail that's gone into the design of this wheel. So I thought it was important. So quick word on connectivity as well. So we can see a little connector here for connecting to our PC directly via USB. Also have the ability to connect this wheel to your PC via Bluetooth. Now, it's not using any sort of proprietary protocol. Remembering that the VRS Direct Force Pro wheelbase doesn't have any sort of built-in proprietary protocol for communication with a wheel. So you will require Bluetooth on your PC. You can do that via a little USB dongle if your motherboard doesn't have it integrated. A lot of motherboards these days do actually have integrated Bluetooth, and we will test that out when we get up and running in just a minute. But the USB cable, should you wish to use that, is, you know, decent for what it is. It's a nice coiled cable, so there's plenty of extension available there. USB-A connection on one end, as you would expect, and then this little tiny screw-in connector on the other side. So that's going to screw into the wheel. It is keyed, so it will only go in one way, and then it just screws in like so. So look, it is quite small, but it does feel pretty substantial and pretty sturdy in there. I think once you've got a quick release mounted as well, it's going to give it a little bit more protection. We'll talk about the quick release in just a minute. We haven't forgotten about it, but I think there's enough there. And I do like the fact that the connection is relatively low profile as well. It doesn't stick out a mile. One of the issues that I have had with a couple of wheels is once you've got the big fat connector on the back, this is an example from a Grid Engineering wheel, but it's a very similar connection that you'll find on a Ascher Racing USB dedicated wheel as well. So you can see that actually sticks out quite a lot further from the base itself. So you can imagine you need to have quite a bit of clearance between the back of the wheel and your wheelbase to make sure that that's not always bending and moving the cable beyond its bend radius tolerance. And that one's actually already got quite a bit of a kink on it just from me driving in the limited time that I have actually spent with that particular wheel. So yeah, look, I don't have a problem with it. And again, remembering that these wheels have been tested by professional esports drivers for extended periods of time. So I'm sure if there were any issues there, that would have been addressed in the design. What I will say though is that I do really like the Q-Con connector that you get with Cube Controls wheels. So let me just grab that quickly for you. Now, again, you can see this in all of our Cube Controls wheels reviews, so I'm only going to just gloss over it now, but you've got a magnetic connector on this side, a 4-pin assembly on this side, and you literally just put it on like so. What that means is if there's ever a scenario where the wheel gets out of control and it goes crazy on you, it's just going to pull off. It's not going to cause any damage, but it is strong enough that it doesn't come off when you're driving. And I've driven with this particular wheel for probably 50 or 60 hours by now, I guess I would say, and I've never once had an issue with it coming disconnected by accident. So I do think that the Cube Controls Q-Con connector is the better design overall. You're welcome to disagree with me on that one, but yeah, I don't see any issues with this connection either. So yeah, no problems there. So then lastly on the wheel, just wanted to quickly touch on the grips as well. And these are that same rubberized material that if you've seen any of my recent wheel reviews, you would know I'm not a huge fan of. The reason for that is that it does feel quite tacky and sticky under your hands. It also tends to be a dirt and debris and dead skin cell magnet. You can see it's kind of just picked up all this crap and it just looks kind of gross. Now, they are easy to clean. It's not really a problem. But when your hands get all sweaty in the heat of the race and everything, it just feels a little bit clammy and gross under hands. Now, it does provide a good amount of grip and there is a good amount of squish in these grips as well. So when you're driving with gloves on, absolutely no complaints. And I'm sure that's what most people would be doing with a wheel of this price point anyway. So it's certainly not a deal breaker. But again, just comparing across to the F Pro from Cube Controls. This has a very similar material. It's still got the same amount of squish to it, so it feels quite nice under hand, but it's got a smooth kind of texture to it rather than that clammy, sticky material. And yeah, I'm just not a huge fan of this subjectively, so it is what it is. But what I will point out, and one thing that I am really happy to see with this particular wheel is if you have a look around on the back here, there are actually 3 little screw holes here. So the grips are actually replaceable on these wheels, which is not something that we see very often on sim racing wheels and something that I am a huge fan of. Now, apparently they might be coming out with some thicker grips as well as maybe some other materials in the future, but that also opens the door to other third parties to create grips that are easily replaceable without having to pull the wheel apart completely. So say Pineapple Grips, for example, we did a review of some of their aftermarket grips for Fanatic wheels probably about a year and a half ago now. I'll put a link down in the description below for you guys. But the end result with those was really good, but the installation process was quite involved to the point where I'm sure a lot of people probably wouldn't be prepared to do something like that. Whereas with this, it's literally just 3 screws on either side, take the grips off, and you're good to go. So look, we haven't had any major wear and tear issues with this material on any other wheels that we've tested in the past, but if you are an esports professional that's putting hours and hours and hours into the same wheel over and over again, then, you know, ultimately at some point you are going to run into some wear and tear. So it's a great touch that you're able to replace those nice and easily. So super quick look internally as well. Just a couple of things that I wanted to point out to you. Firstly, I want you to appreciate how clean the internal design here is. As I was alluding to earlier, you can see it's all one PCB throughout the entire enclosure. There's no wiring or anything like that anywhere. Everything is soldered directly to the PCB, which is their own design. So you can see they're stamped on the board, VRS Direct Force Pro. All really nice, high quality switches here. 2 Grey Hill switches labeled here. Now, I'm not a switch expert, so I couldn't tell you what's good and what's bad, but I can tell you that everything here at least looks top notch. You can see a STM32 processor sitting on the board there, pretty standard. You can see the Bluetooth circuitry here as well. So that is the little antenna for Bluetooth connectivity. Interestingly, it is a nickel metal hydride battery internally there. So it is a rechargeable battery. And for those interested, it actually is just a standard AA form factor or HR6, 1.2 volts, 2500 milliamp hour AA battery. So you could just theoretically replace that with another nickel metal hydride battery yourself if the need ever arises. It's not actually soldered to the board. I'm not going to take it out because I don't want to accidentally reset anything and break the wheel. But yeah, look, really, really clean design throughout here. You can see the floating style push buttons that I talked about before as well. So those are just little buttons that are surface mounted on the PCB itself. And then as I was talking about earlier, you can see on this side, these are the actual push buttons from the face of the wheel. So if I spin that around, I'm not going to tip it up completely because I don't want everything to fall out, but you can see how the buttons just sit in there and then literally just little CNC machine button caps which sit in each position. So really, really clean design. And yeah, really happy with everything that I'm seeing. A couple of other things to point out too. You can see the little Hall effect sensors there and there on either side. That is for the shifter paddles. Remembering again that there are no electronics inside the shifters themselves, so there's no wiring that has to be fed through or anything like that. So again, keeping things nice and simple. And then lastly, just wanted to also point out these spaces between the front and rear of the wheel too. Remembering earlier we talked about the fact that the rear housing is a plastic design, and you can see here the holes which go through for mounting. We're going to talk about mounting in just a second. But what I'm seeing here is a aluminium insert. Now, I wasn't 100% certain that it was aluminium, but it does feel cold to touch. So I'm pretty confident those inserts are aluminium. So that creates basically like a sandwich plate or a spacer between the front and rear housings, and that's what gives it its rigidity on the actual quick release itself. So that's the reason why it doesn't feel like it twists or bends or anything. That is of course then bolted through to the 5mm thick aluminium front plate, and that is what gives the wheel its overall rigidity without needing to have a particularly strong actual housing on the rear of the wheel. Now I'm not sure, I don't want to pull the PCB out, I'm not sure exactly how the shifters are getting their rigidity. But again, as I said earlier, there's absolutely no flex in those shifters whatsoever. So whatever they've done there, it seems to work absolutely fine. I can actually see if I look through there, it looks like there might actually be another aluminium housing or something underneath that PCB to hold that all in place and keep it nice and solid. There's actually quite a bit of weight in this rear half, even just without the front half attached. So let's talk now about mounting. So we've got a standard 70mm bolt pattern here with 3 holes on the wheel, which pass all the way through with those aluminium spacers that we saw earlier for that added rigidity. Now, a lot of wheels will have 6 holes cut out. In my experience, 3 is enough to have a secure mounting. You'll see any of the other wheels that I've got here in the studio, pretty much I'm only using 3 bolts. In the case of Cube Controls, what they do is they alternate between threaded holes and non-threaded holes, so you can mount through the front or through the back. So you only ever really have 3 mounting points on any given wheel, and you can see the same here on the Ascher Racing wheel as well. I've only actually used 3 bolts to secure it, and it's absolutely fine. So no issues there whatsoever. So the wheel itself is going to come with 3 bolts that are long enough to go through the wheel and then into whatever quick release you might be wanting to use on the rear side. So provided that that has threads on it, that would screw through from that side. So no real issues when it comes to mounting the wheel to any quick release of your choice. Just keeping in mind that because the bolts do have to pass through from the front to the rear, you might need to use some security nuts behind the quick release, depending on whether your adapter has threaded holes or not. Most quick releases have the option for both anyway, so you shouldn't have any issues at all there. Now, when it comes to actually mounting this wheel on a VRS Direct Force Pro or any other midge wheelbase, we do have a couple of different options which I want to run you through here. These are all just the options from VRS. Obviously, you can use whatever quick release you want as long as it's compatible with the midge style motor. So let's run you through quickly now. This is the standard VRS 70mm to midge mount. So what this would do is just go over the shaft on your wheelbase, and then it gives you a standard 70mm bolt pattern on the front, which you can bolt whatever quick release you happen to want to use directly to your motor. So that's actually a new revised design over the one that we're actually running on the rig behind me right now. So yeah, it's not actually listed on their website yet, but once that's up there, you guys will be able to find out pricing and everything for yourselves. And then moving on to their own quick release. So we've got the motor side shaft here, which looks a little bit funny. So what essentially happens here is the shaft itself slides over the motor. There's actually a little tiny key inside this box as well. So that would simply go in the keyway that's cut out on the motor. And then this slides over the motor shaft, clamps down using the provided bolt, and then that gives you your mounting surface for the quick release to then mount to. So this is a Crontex style quick release, very commonly used in real life race cars. I believe this is a similar design to what we're expecting to see from the Fanatic QR2 as well, if I'm not mistaken. I saw a couple of leaked photos a couple of years ago now, I want to say. It may have changed since then, but yeah, I believe it's going to look something like this, but we should have one of those here pretty soon to look at. So the way this works is this side, you pull on the tab, and you can see the 2 little metal arms then retract. And if you look really carefully, you can see it's not actually a perfect circle. So you've got to match the direction to this. So it's going to go this way up. We pull on that, we slip it over, and that gives us a nice firm connection there. Obviously, we can't really test for flex with bare hands, but we'll show you on the rig a little bit later on. So to release again, you simply just pull on the collar and it comes off Simple as that. So really nice design. I also like the fact that this is only 48 millimeters thick as well. So it gives you a nice slim mounting solution. With this up and nice and close to the back of the wheel, you're not having to have the wheels spaced out too far away from you, which is a nice little touch there. So yeah, overall, really impressed with this design. Nice and clean and very race car-esque, I would say. So in terms of actually mounting this to your wheel, inside the box, you'll see two little adapters like this. One of these will actually be pre-installed on the quick release. And then there's four little bolts which actually secure this to the quick release mechanism itself. So I'm not going to put those in now, but you can imagine they go through like that, and that's what secures this part to that part. And the reason for that is that you need to have both threaded and non-threaded versions of these adapters, so that if you've got a wheel that you're mounting through from the front, you can go into threads on the back, or if you're mounting from the back, you can go through the other direction. So as I mentioned earlier, the wheel itself actually comes with screws which are appropriate to mount into the threads on the back of one of these. And then the quick release actually comes with these shorter screws. So if you're going through from the back into the wheel, you can mount in that way. So let's get it mounted up on the wheel now, get the wheel up on the rig and do some driving. Okay, so time to talk about software. Now, unfortunately, as it stands right now at the time of recording this video, there's the existing software that's available for download on their website is a bit of a mess. Now, there is new software coming out, which we're going to be looking at in today's video. That should be available within the next couple of weeks, or maybe even by the time you guys are seeing this video. But I thought it was important to acknowledge the fact that the existing software is a little bit clunky, to say the least, just to, I guess, respect the people that have already bought one of these and their experience, and, you know, acknowledge the experience as it is right now if you were to be buying one of these wheels. Now, the issues that we had there were basically, and you guys can, if you look back through and have a look at our previous VRS Direct Force Pro wheelbase and pedal reviews, you'll see the software is functional and it does all the things it needs to do, but it's quite outdated in its appearance and it doesn't bring all the various components of their ecosystem into the one package. In the case of the wheel, you actually had to run a different utility for the wheel settings from what you run for the base and the pedals. And that actually creates a conflict. So if you run both software packages at once, then it ends up just locking up the PC completely and nothing works. So we actually ended up spending an entire day just trying to get things running in that software, and I had all kinds of issues with it. So moving forward, this new software does work very well, but just in case there are any further delays, I just thought that it was important to let you guys know that the experience right now isn't absolutely fantastic. Now, another issue that we had was also Bluetooth connectivity. I wasn't able to get this wheel to connect to any of my three PCs that I tested it with. I was able to get it to connect and be detected by my phone though, which was a little bit weird. So the method for connecting to a PC is simply to make sure it's not plugged in via USB and press any button on the wheel to make sure that the LED in the center is blinking. That indicates that it's in pairing mode. And then you bring up the add a new Bluetooth device console in Windows and it should just detect it and be all good. Now, obviously you do need to make sure that you have a PC that is supporting Bluetooth. In my case, all the motherboards that I tried this with do support Bluetooth natively. I did try all the various different firmware versions, including the latest beta version that's available for this wheel as well. Nothing was able to get that working. So that was a little bit unfortunate. I'm hoping that's something that they can fix. But please do let us know in the comments if you own one of these wheels, have you had the same issues with Bluetooth connectivity? I think that's going to be valuable for people that might be buying this to be aware of. But anyway, let's dive in now and take a look at this new VRS Direct Force Pro software. So as I touched on earlier, this brings all of the various different components of the ecosystem together in one software package, which is something we're seeing a lot more of in sim racing in general lately, which is very, very good. It means you don't have to have multiple software packages running for various different components on your rig as long as you're within the one ecosystem. So you can see here, we've got settings for our wheelbase, our pedals, and our steering wheel. Any other peripherals that they might bring out in the future which require a USB connection to your PC should also show up in this software as well. So just to quickly give you a look at this, because I haven't shown you guys this before, if we click on wheelbase, it takes you through a nice clean interface now that gives you access to all the settings. There are still a few bugs that they're ironing out, but again, by the time you guys are seeing this video, hopefully this software will be released and those bugs will be fixed. Just little things like settings not sticking when you save profiles and things like that. But a nice clean interface here, as you can see. We can go back, we can go into our pedal settings as well and do all of our calibration and linearity adjustments here too. And yeah, just overall a very nicely presented piece of software, which is a big upgrade that brings them into the 21st century, I guess you could say, because their old software was very clunky. Functional, but yeah, quite clunky. So let's go in and have a look at what we can do with the steering wheel now. So it's not massively complex in the features that it offers, but there are a couple of really important things here which I think are very good to see. So we've got a drop-down menu here for our analog input mode. Now, interestingly, in this particular version of the software, it only has dual clutch mode. I would imagine that by release, this should have an analog access mode that allows you to map a throttle and a brake, or maybe a handbrake or something like that. But at the moment, it does seem to only allow you to do dual clutch. You can, however, choose whether you want the right or left hand to be the master. So that will stipulate whether you're releasing the left hand to get to your bite point or the right hand to get to the bite point. We then have an adjustment down here to adjust that bite point as well. So that's going to impact where exactly that bite point sits for each car that you're driving, and you can save profiles here too. So if you're wanting to save different profiles to different vehicles, so you're not having to adjust this every single time, then that is definitely doable. One thing I would like to see here is the ability to make adjustments to this on the fly from the wheel itself without having to Alt-Tab in and go into the software. That is something that hopefully they'll be able to do. It's something that we're seeing on a lot of other wheels these days, but as it stands right now, not something that you can do with this particular wheel. At least it doesn't mention anything about it in the documentation. You can also adjust dead zones here for the minimum and maximum for the left and right clutches. So that's just going to allow you to adjust things to your own personal preference and make sure that you're not falling just short of 100% or sitting just a little bit above 0%. Obviously, you don't want to have your clutch being mistakenly engaged while you're driving. So that's good to have those adjustments there too. We already talked about bite point adjustment. Now these next two settings, attack and hysteresis, I'm really happy to see. So attack point allows us to adjust how sensitive the shifters are to input. Now, as we looked at earlier, the shifters do have a nice purposeful click to them. So you're not gonna be, wondering whether you've pulled a shifter or not. But what this allows you to do is adjust the threshold at which it actually activates the shift. So you can see at the moment, that little 62, which indicates that it's been detected as a digital input inside the game. You can see if I pull that to almost the threshold, but not quite the point where it clicks, that is where it activates inside the game. So if you've got a habit of kind of holding the shifters a little bit in and you're mis-shifting all the time, this is going to allow you to adjust for that. So if I go to the minimum attack point here, you can see now it's extremely sensitive. So even just the little tiniest bit of movement on that Hall effect sensor is going to activate the shift inside the game. If I wind it all the way to 100%, now I actually have to get almost to the threshold of the click before it activates. So it's not quite as sensitive in its adjustment on this particular wheel. It may vary from wheel to wheel because this is a very sensitive thing, but you get the idea here. It allows you to adjust that threshold point where it's actually going to activate the click to account for mis-shifting and things like that. So something that I do think is quite valuable and something that I would like to see on more wheels. So I'm going to wind that back to 100%, which is my personal preference. So then hysteresis just adds a little bit of delay on the release of the shifter as well. So if you're finding that you're pulling the shifter too quickly and it's not registering a shift inside the game, you can account for that here as well. So again, it just allows you to fine tune things to your own personal preference, which I think is always a good thing. So then we've got two adjustments here for our rotary encoders. You can see we can change between 12-way rotary, which is like a multi-position switch setting, 12-way rotary pulsed, and then encoder. So in the default 12-way rotary setting, you can see number 1 was highlighted, and then we go through 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So those are always active. So provided that the game that you're playing supports it, what that means is you can actually assign position 1 to engine map 1 inside the game and so forth all the way through to position number 12. Whereas if you have this in rotary encoder mode, what it's going to do is it's going to send a pulse each time you move the switch. So it's not going to actually register the physical position. That means that if you, say, go out of the game and then come back in with the switch starting at position number 10, then number 10 is going to correlate to engine map number 1, for example, and so forth. So multi-position switches aren't supported by every single sim racing title, which is why it's important to have both options available here. And then finally, the 12-way rotary pulsed setting works exactly the same way as the multi-position switch setting, but instead of sending that signal all the time, you can see now in each position, it's only sending a momentary pulse. So again, it's just a compatibility option there to make sure that this is going to work with pretty much every single racing title, and we didn't find any scenarios where this didn't work. You've got the ability here to adjust this setting for either one of those rotary encoder / multi-position switches too. So that is a good thing. I'm going to set that back to 12-way rotary. Then we also have an adjustment here for our encoder pulse width. So this is kind of like the hysteresis for the shifter paddles. What this is going to do is it's going to adjust the duration of that pulse. So if you're finding that when you make an adjustment to one of the rotary encoders, it's not registering every single time, you can increase this pulse width, and that should account for that problem. If you're finding that it's changing multiple times per movement, then you can wind that down and it should come good as well. So again, a good thing to have here. This is something that we've seen on a couple of wheels now. The Ascher Racing wheels that connect via USB have this setting, for example, and something that I would like to see in more wheels moving forward. And then finally down the bottom here, we've got a adjustment just for our LED brightness as well. So just lastly here, there is a calibration tool for calibrating the shifters and paddles here. This did lock up the PC as well, so this is obviously something that they're going to need to fix for the final release of the software, so I'm not going to run through that now. And then you also do have the ability to update your firmware from here as well, and that's one thing they have improved on across the board with this software. The firmware is actually cooked into the software package now, so you don't have to rummage around and try and find firmware files to download and flash to the base. There was always a bit of an issue there with if you didn't have the correct firmware matched with the correct version of the software, things would go a little bit crazy. So it's a lot more intuitive now than it used to be. And that is a quick look over the software. So let's jump now into the overall driving experience and conclusions. So driving experience, let's start talking about the quick release. I absolutely love this quick release. It's very, very easy to use. It has that real kind of race car feel to it as well. It rattles around a little bit when it's not engaged, just when you pull the lever, but I actually kind of like that. It feels mechanical and just like a real life race car part, which is really cool. So yeah, definitely a big thumbs up for the quick release. Nice and easy to use and a good solid connection too. There's no excessive flex in there. There's a little bit of side to side movement, just throughout the entire assembly from the stem all the way through to the face of the wheel. There's going to be a little bit of flex in various different areas where the plate is actually mounting up to the face of the wheel and so forth. We saw before how they've kind of minimized that through the clever design internally, despite it being a plastic housing on the rear of the wheel. So no issues at all with regards to the quick release. I think you're absolutely going to be satisfied with that. And look, in terms of the wheel itself, I think overall it's a very good driving experience. One observation I did have with regards to the buttons, which I didn't touch on when we were talking on the desk earlier, is that they do have a bit of a metal rattle to them. So if I shake my hand around on the wheel, you can hear that they do rattle within the housing. Now, they don't rattle when I wiggle the wheel from side to side, so I don't think that it's a problem, but it may be something that bothers you, and it's not something that I've experienced with other wheels at this kind of price point. So something to consider there. I don't think it's going to be a problem for anybody though. One other really small nitpick here, but I think at the price point, this is something that needs to be called out because it's not a problem with other wheels at this price point. There is a little tiny bit of plastic creaking that you can hear if you twist the wheel in your hands. Now, when you're driving, you're certainly not going to feel or hear this, so I really don't think that it's a problem. But again, when we're talking about a wheel at this price point, this isn't a problem with any other wheel at this kind of price point that I've tested at least. All those other wheels have aluminium rear casings, which avoids this issue entirely. The analog paddles have a really nice progressive feel to them as well, so plenty of control and yeah, plenty of detail there. The shifters have a good feel to them as well, a nice positive click as we discussed earlier. They are very loud when I'm driving. That's one thing that did stand out to me compared to some other wheels. Similar kind of volume level to the Ascher Racing wheels, but if we compare to something like the F-Core, which admittedly the shifters on this aren't anywhere near as nice in terms of the feeling, you can hear those are pretty quiet and much louder. So if you are racing in an environment where you've got somebody trying to sleep right next door to you or study or something like that, watch TV, then yeah, this is probably something that you're going to want to consider pretty closely because they are definitely going to be the loudest thing on your sim rig, provided that you're racing with headphones, of course. So just be mindful of that. The buttons all have a really nice feel to them. Rotary encoders feel really nice. Didn't really have any additional observations there in addition to what we already discussed on the table earlier. Absolutely no issues whatsoever with reaching buttons. I do really wish that it had rotary encoders for the thumbs. That's something that I complain about on every single wheel that doesn't have them. I know, so you're probably sick of hearing it, but I feel like at this price point, The wheel is a little bit limited in its functionality compared to some of the options that we have available on the market. But I think, look, if you're looking for a really clean wheel that just does what it does and does what it does really well, and doesn't look over the top and overstated on your rig, then this is a very good option. I just feel like it's a little bit too expensive for what it's bringing to the table compared to some of the other options on the market. And look, I know that there's been a bit of an argument here around the pricing, simply because a lot of people were surprised at how expensive the wheel is compared to their other products. The wheel is actually more expensive than the wheelbase, which just doesn't seem right, and then twice the price of the 2-pedal set. Now, I think there's a few psychological things that are kind of going on here, because you know, the VRS Direct Force Pro wheelbase and pedals are some of the best value for money sim racing products available on the market, in my opinion. The pedals in particular, I think, are absolutely exceptional value for money, and definitely right up there with my top recommendations for load cell pedals, particularly compared to the other options available on the market. I really do think they nailed it there. And look, I can see where the money is in this wheel. As you guys saw on the table, they've used top shelf, top quality components throughout this wheel. And like I said, everything that it does do exceptionally well. So I think if you were to remove those other products from the equation, if you weren't using those as a reference point for how expensive you feel like the wheel should be, then the pricing does definitely make more sense. And I think that's probably the more fair and objective way of looking at this. But having said that, removing everything else from the equation and just comparing the wheel to what else is available at this kind of price point and cheaper, I just feel like this needs to be at least $100 US cheaper than what it is to really be competitive. So in terms of the build quality and the overall feel of using this wheel, I would put this on par with the Ascher Racing wheels. Now, this is the F64 wireless version. There is a USB version of this as well. We reviewed this on the channel just recently. So this wheel ends up being about 10% more expensive than the VRS wheel. For that extra 10%, you are getting the aluminium rear housing, and you are getting quite a bit of additional functionality in terms of inputs here. Some of that functionality isn't going to be useful to a lot of people. So look, overall, the driving experience is quite similar between the two. And I do feel like this wheel is a little bit on the expensive side as well. But one thing I do really like about this wheel is the fact that we have those thumb encoders, as we've touched on multiple times now. So yeah, look, I think in terms of value for money, quite similar to what we get with the Ascher Racing wheel. Now, we looked earlier at the Grid by SimLab MPX wheel as well. And again, this is quite similar in the overall driving experience. I really am a big fan of some of the additional functionality on this particular wheel, though. I really like the illumination, and we're gonna have a review coming up very soon on the channel of this particular wheel, but really love the position of the two 7-way funky switches. I like the brake magic buttons on the back here as well. Those are quite handy, and 4 thumb encoders on this wheel as well. Now, the retail price of this wheel is about $200 more than the VRS wheel, but I have actually seen it for sale for the same price. So if you shop around and you can get a good deal on this wheel for the same price as the VRS wheel, I think that just purely from a functionality standpoint, this is the better value wheel. But then if we look at Cube Control's offerings, we've got the F Pro, which again does have more functionality than what we have here. The overall build quality in some areas is a little bit higher, but in some areas lacking a little bit as well. I do prefer the hand grips on this. We touched on earlier the fact that I just subjectively don't like this tacky, sticky material that they use on a lot of hand grips on wheels these days, the VRS wheel included, simply because it just feels kind of gross in your hands if you're not wearing gloves, and it tends to pick up dirt and debris, dead skin cells. So it's definitely something to be aware of there. That isn't an issue with the F Pro wheel. But again, with this wheel, we've got a lot of functionality in terms of illumination. We've got a lot more button inputs. We've got 4 thumb encoders as well. And when you consider that this wheel comes in at around about $1,030 if you account for the taxes, so about $30 more expensive than the VRS wheel. And obviously that will vary depending on where you are and shipping costs and things like that. But as a basic indication, around about the same price as well. Again, you may prefer the cleaner look of the VRS wheel. You may prefer the more solid, kind of clunky feeling of the shifters. I think objectively, this has probably got higher build quality than the Cube Controls wheel does for the same price. But it really just comes down to a question of whether you like that additional functionality. And again, we have a full review of this wheel available on the channel too. But then I think really the closest comparison here in terms of functionality is probably actually the Cube Controls F Core wheel. This does pretty much all the same things that you can do with the VRS wheel, with the exception purely of just those multi-position switches. But we've got two 7-way funky switches here. We do actually have two thumb encoders on this wheel. And look, the build quality here isn't anywhere near as high in terms of the touch points. The buttons don't have as nice a feel to them. The shifters definitely don't feel as nice as they do on the VRS wheel. The analog paddles are absolutely fine. Again, we do have a full review of this wheel on the channel as well. But the big point here is that you're getting very similar functionality here. And whilst the build quality isn't as good, it is still very high. We do have an aluminium rear housing here. There's no issues with flex or anything like that. And look, for an overall driving experience, there's not a whole lot between them, just with the exception of the shifters, I would say. That's probably the one thing that stands out as being inferior on this wheel compared to the VRS wheel. Another thing to note there as well is that the F-Core wheel is quite a bit lighter than the VRS wheel as well, despite having that aluminium rear housing as opposed to the plastic on the VRS. So that's, if you're running a weaker wheelbase, will definitely be a factor. But the Cube Controls F-Core wheel comes in at not much more than half the price of the VRS wheel. And I think that's definitely, that definitely raises some questions there. So yeah, in conclusion, I think it is an excellent wheel. They definitely need to get that new software nailed, get all the bugs ironed out of it and get that released to the public, because the experience with the existing software as it stands right now at the time of making this video that's available on their download page just isn't a good experience. It's very cumbersome and very frustrating to use, at least in my experience. So they definitely need to get that sorted out. But yeah, I think if this wheel has all the functionality that you want and you're after something that's nice and clean and well presented with a high build quality, then yeah, you're gonna be absolutely satisfied with this wheel. I just can't help but feel that at this price point, to really be competitive in the market, it does need a little bit more functionality. I think if it had 4 thumb encoders on it, it would definitely be closer to the MPX and the Ascher Racing wheel for me. But at the pricing that this is at currently, and again, I'm not looking at this relative to the cost of the wheelbase and the pedals, which I do think are exceptional value, but comparing this to other options that are available on the market, I would personally struggle to justify the cost of this over something like the F-Core or the Ascher Racing V3 or the Grid by SimLab MPX. I think that those are all objectively better offerings with more functionality for a similar kind of price point. And then when you consider that you're getting almost the same functionality from something like the F-Core wheel from Cube Controls at just a little bit more than half the price of this, it does become a bit of a tough sell. But again, it is a very good wheel. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the wheel. And if you do choose to buy one of these, I'm sure that you're going to be satisfied with it. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out, guys. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss future videos, particularly that Grid MPX wheel review that's going to be coming up very soon. And make sure you check down in the description as well for the links to all the reviews that we've done on the other wheels that we talked about in today's video too. And as we said before, if you do want to pick up any of the stuff that we've looked at in today's video, including the VRS wheel, we do have some affiliate links down in the description below. Those are an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you if you find what we do here valuable and beneficial. So thanks very much for watching, guys, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye.